This was a total curveball, right? So if you had been paying attention, if you were a kind of, in that tech community, then you will know that as long ago as last summer, people were saying, you know what, this Chinese AI is pretty good, actually. Like the gap between Chinese and US technology is not as big as people think. And everyone was like, yeah, whatever. The US tech is like world beating. You can't seriously challenge this stuff. And then in December and in early January, DeepSeek, the Chinese AI that has just sort of rattled markets, they came out with more detail, and they also allowed people to kind of play with the tool. So DeepSeek is basically like ChatGPT, but it's Chinese technology, basically the same thing. And people who were looking at it, who had originally been saying, don't worry, pretty sure this is going to be rubbish, were like, oh, it's actually really good. And it's got some quite cool innovations in the way it answers questions. So I'm not going to claim to be a tech expert by any stretch of the imagination, but apparently, while it's giving you quite a long answer to things, it pauses and thinks a little bit more in the process and kind of tests its own reasoning and has a bit more of a kind of back and forth with itself to come to answers that are a bit more satisfying. So that's quite interesting, right? And the really interesting thing is, so DeepSeek, big challenge to ChatGPT, much cheaper, uses a lot less energy. But also, apparently, there's a whole queue of these Chinese AI tools that are just waiting to hit the road. So the reason this is really important for markets is that US AI, US big tech, have been seen as being just utterly, heavyweight champions of the world. You cannot defeat these guys. And they've been going to the markets and going to private investors and going to governments and saying, we need billions and billions, we need trillions of dollars of investment to make this work and build all the energy infrastructure that we need around it, because these things like drink energy, like in a way that we can hardly understand. Turns out the Chinese can do it for $5 million, they're saying.
Yeah.
They can do it for $5 million. The end product is actually pretty good. And they need far fewer of these very clever microchips from NVIDIA in the States. And they need older versions of these very clever microchips from NVIDIA in the States. And so this knocks a big hole into the idea that US big tech is as secure as it seemed. And the reason that in turn matters is like a couple of reasons. Like, firstly, these magnificent seven stocks, right? The big US tech stocks, I'm going to forget some, but you've got NVIDIA, which is a $3 trillion company, but you've also got the companies that have been spending massively on NVIDIA chips. So you've got Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, which is Google, Tesla, that whole gang. They account for 1/3 of the entire benchmark US stock index, the S&P 500. So if anything goes wrong with any of those guys, which it did in recent days because NVIDIA fell really hard, that's problematic for the entire market. But also, it's not just the Mag 7, as people call them. There's a whole bunch of energy providers that have ridden the coattails of this whole AI revolution. They provide the power to the data centers, or they build the data centers. These are like football field size, like almost like aircraft hangars full of computers. And it turns out that maybe you kind of don't need all of that, or you don't need it on quite the scale that we previously thought. And so actually some of the biggest victims of the emergence of DeepSeek in China have been US energy stocks and European energy stocks. Now, the opportunity this all throws up is, if the Chinese can do it, the Brits could even do it. Like, we could,
Don't get carried away.
I was very optimistic.
You can't even get the trains to work.
Theoretically possible, right? We could do it, right? And, there is already some decent efforts in this space from the French in Mistral. But, Europe can do it. So this idea that the US sits atop the global economy and global markets and cannot be knocked off this perch, this emergence of DeepSeek is the first time that narrative has been challenged, at least since the pandemic, to my mind. So I think it's a really interesting juncture.
Maybe in 100 years, it kind of rocks like American exceptionalism, doesn't it?
Completely.
It kind of like, it's like hold on, there could be another player. There could be, and then that feeds into all of the concerns around, say, like the dollar. And it's like much broader than just tech. It's America, and it's... place at the top of the pile.
So some investors that I speak to say, look, I want to buy stocks like Nvidia, firstly, because they have absolutely rocketed and this company is making boatloads of money, like uncountable amounts of money. It's not like the dot-com boom and bust of like 20 odd years ago.
They have the cash flows.
These are companies that make proper money, like 30 odd billion dollars a quarter in like profits kind of money. Like this is serious cash. But so it's not the same thing, but there is this idea that investing in those stocks is not just good for your wallet, but also it means that you're kind of gluing yourself to the US's sort of geopolitical, geostrategic dominance. Like we're doing something that China can't do. We're doing something that Europe can't do. You know, that means that the US just has more power geopolitically. And so anything that chips away at that, and Donald Trump is doing other stuff to chip away at US exceptionalism on a kind of political front, but nonetheless, anything that chips away at that, I think is significant.
That was a clip from our full-length conversation with markets columnist from the FT, Katie Martin. You can watch the full episode right here.
Isn't it?